I'm standing in front of the Meadow at Cannon and Liberty Road. This is part of the Liberty Park conservation area. At this point, we have just entered our second year of managing this not as cropland but as wildlife habitat. This season we have just a tremendous amount of butterflies. The butterflies have benefited from 2 years of not disturbing the site, the meadow, and the populations are up very high. So if you enjoy butterflies, this is a great place to come and hike the trail for that opportunity. So what is a meadow? The interpretation of what a meadow is pretty difficult to define. It can be a wildflower meadow, which we're striving to create here. It could be a prairie meadow. Meadow is a subject to be defined by many different people in different ways. But basically, open areas that are primarily treeless, shrubless, primarily grassy. Areas such as that are considered meadows. When we talk about meadow nesting birds, we're talking about birds that will only nest in open areas such as you see behind me, grassy, with wildflowers and so forth, but again, treeless, shrubless. That's how we'll manage this, by keeping out the shrub growth and the tree growth, because in Ohio, we're losing this valuable meadow habitat. It is either developed for housing or businesses, farms. We've got a lot of people here in Ohio and we're using the meadows up. So what we're doing here is trying to set aside a little bit of this grassy area. We're adding wildflowers, which have been eliminated over time. We're going to add wildflowers each year, and as they mature, you'll be seeing more of that. That helps the butterflies and other pollinators, which are, quite frankly, critical to our economy. And then birds. We have some endangered species that are actually using this field, whether they be hawks that are going after the little field mice that are here, or whether they be sparrows and bobolinks. We have a nesting pair of meadowlarks here. And if you go all through Summit County, you'll have great difficulty finding those species still persisting because we have pretty much cleared it all out. So this is a tiny little museum space. We can go through here, hear the crickets, the katydids, watch the butterflies, hear the bird song in the springtime, and just see a little bit of nature protected here. Well, I think I'm ready to take a walk in the meadow, and I'd like to show you some of the things that I see on a regular basis. As we begin our walk here in Liberty Park, we're following this meadow trail where we seem to be kicking up a lot of grasshoppers, an enormous amount of them here in the park this year. And they tell me that this all runs in cycles. The grasshoppers will have peaks, and then you'll go several years and not see so many. And this apparently is one of those peak years. Grasshoppers, you might wonder, what on earth are they good for? Well, the fact is, grasshoppers in a meadow, such as we have here, are extremely good sources of protein for the bird species. Parents will catch these grasshoppers, and just at the time when the grasshopper is a tender little morsel, a young grasshopper, is when the baby birds need something tender and full of protein. So it's a very easy to catch, abundant food supply for the bird species that we have here in the meadow. Now, another consumer of grasshopper protein happens to be one of several species of praying mantis. In Ohio, we have 3 that I'm aware of. 2 of them are from across the ocean. They were imported here either intentionally or accidentally. And then we have another one called the Carolina mantis that is a native to Ohio. Most commonly, the Carolina mantis is found in southern Ohio, and frankly, I've never seen one in this part of the state. The ones we most commonly see are the big European mantis or the Chinese mantis, and these creatures are amazingly talented at catching prey. In fact, you can walk by a number of them as they perch rock still on a stem, and you'll never see them. Their colors are very well camouflaged to blend in with the vegetation, but once a creature flies within their grasp, they strike out with lightning-like speed, and the hooks on their forearms are very exquisite little devices for holding prey once they grasp them. Well, we've just located a katydid, and katydids are masters at mimicry. Some of the species look very much like the leaf on a tree. Others have grass blade shapes. Katydids come in a lot of different sizes, colors. The predominant color, though, is green. And the katydid is a summer songster. They, for people that really know their songs, they can identify them simply by hearing the katydid singing. And of course, the song that has been written about over time has been about the katydid that says, Katy did, Katy didn't, Katy did, Katy didn't. And that rhythm has probably put a lot of children to sleep at night when the windows were open in the country. So katydids are a very interesting species. And how do you know if you've got a katydid or a grasshopper? Well, one of the ways is that the katydids will often have a very long sword-like appendage in their tail. Another, though, is the fact that their antennas are actually longer than their bodies. A true grasshopper has an antenna that is just a fraction of their body length. Otherwise, many of the katydids look just like a grasshopper or other insect. Now, katydids can be found in brushy areas, they can be found in trees. So they have different habitats to fit the species. But one thing about it, whenever you see a katydid, it's worth a close-up look. One of the things you'll find as you walk the Meadow Trail here in Liberty Park is several old rustic logs perched in the ground, and attached to those logs are some bird houses. And you might wonder about that. You might wonder what uses those houses, and actually we've put them out for homes for the eastern bluebird. The eastern bluebird is not all that rare in northeastern Ohio, but at the same time it's always in need of additional housing. It likes open areas with trees on the edge or even trees in the middle of it, but it needs a dead tree with a hollow spot because the eastern bluebird is a cavity nester, which means a hole in a tree. So these little boxes are put out for the eastern bluebird. Our population is quite good here at Liberty Park, but another bird species that is just as welcome is one of our swallows. It's called the tree swallow. It has a metallic green or blue back and a white breast, and it's one of the valuable insect eaters that we have in our park. Beautiful, beautiful bird in flight, just gorgeous. And it too is a cavity nester and also uses these boxes. And as time goes along, we'll be adding more boxes, and we kind of hope to keep placing them on the old tree logs or tree branches. Give it a rustic feel as opposed to the metal poles that you so often see. This is an area that has not been planted in crops for quite some time. It was left idle as we did some work building ball fields next door, and it was kind of the no man's land. And what has happened is we've got quite a number of different species. It's more diverse than the hay fields that we've allowed to let go. So we have a number of flowering plants that attract butterflies, and as well we have a great habitat for the dragonflies. They come through and munch on the little insects that are here. It's a very interesting area. We've also probably encountered more of the migrating bird species that are not native to this area. They come in here and rest, hunt for food. It's kind of a low spot and maybe a little damper than the rest of the area. So it's one of my favorite places to come and observe. This dragonfly that we're looking at now here along the trail is probably the second smallest dragonfly in Ohio. It's called the Eastern Amberwing. It's, I always like to relate to food, so it's kind of the color of root beer. It's a little tiny dragonfly, very territorial. If you disturb it off of its roost or hunting place, it'll probably return very near to or to the exact spot. Beautiful insect, and for the people trying to learn how to photograph insects, this is a very cooperative little dragonfly. The bird we're looking at now, at first I thought was a juvenile meadowlark, but it's actually a male bobolink, and probably shedding his bright colors to look more like the females. As they migrate, he'll lose the vivid black and yellow white markings that the males normally carry during the breeding season. So this bird had me fooled at first, but they have a short stubby tail, and I don't know if this will show in the film, but it does have that. He just dropped out of sight, and he's in the accompaniment of what looked like another bobolink. So we know now that it was a bobolink with its plumage change. There's some flying as I speak. They are now all very dull and subdued in color, but during the nesting season, it's only the female who has the dark brown stripes on her head that matches some of the coarser grass stems and weed stems. Her body is sparrow colored, which means it's rather brown. That's all to protect the nest and young, of course. The male is an unusually marked bird because its underside is not colorful. If you think about the bluebird and the robin, they are red-breasted birds. Their colors beneath. Well, the bobolink has its color on its back. It has white behind the head, yellow. It is very colorful, white in the wings, but from below it is solid black. Very interesting and significant of a bird species that uses only meadows in which to nest. Beyond that, the migration, it starts quite early. Probably these birds will be gone before the end of August. It does require insects here to feed on, and they'll be moving along as the insect time comes to an end. This is a very interesting plant we've come across on our walk through the meadow. It actually has one of my favorite common names. It's called Indian tobacco. And it's a member of the lobelia family, has tiny little pale blue flowers. And if you find a little plant like this, it grows in some other habitats as well. One of the ways that you can kind of check on your identification is to note that where the flower has fallen off, you'll find little inflated capsules like you see right here. I get that in the light. This little capsule right here looks like a little upside down balloon. That tells you that it's Indian tobacco, along with the other points of identification that you might need to check on. But even when it's out of flower, you see those little inflated balloons, and you know you're looking at Indian tobacco. This is one of the first plant species to actually take over in a abandoned field situation. This is called horse nettle. And if you look closely at the flowers, you'll see that they resemble tomato flowers. And besides that, they have little tomatoes. And these will turn yellow, look just like little tiny yellow tomatoes. However, this plant, besides being very thorny, also is expected that it could be poisonous. It's in the nightshade family. So I wouldn't go picking these tomatoes if I were you. Just enjoy them for their color. And it might also be noted that I often see these laying on the ground in winter and the animals aren't eating them, so that's a good clue. We have a transition area out here at Liberty Park. It's the area just outside the active recreational fields. This is an area that was disturbed during construction, and when we came back to plant it, we planted a mixture of low-growing grasses, clovers, and a number of perennial wildflowers. Now, with only the second year past, we've noticed some additional blooms, and with each year I think we'll see more and more of that. It's a practical use of land that might traditionally have fallen under the blade of the mower. In this case, it blends into the more wild areas of our park, and it's a gradual blend. So we go from mowed to a little higher and then into the tall stuff. And each one of those areas is advantageous to the wildlife out here. Some birds, for example, like a lower grassy area. Some like to nest and feed in the taller grasses. So it all benefits. It benefits the city in the terms of not wasting all that time and energy to mow. It adds a certain amount of color that people walking the trails and standing at a ball game can look out over the area and see some diversity. It really catches the eye, and we've had a number of compliments this summer on this planting mix that we have introduced out here. Now, this wasn't any one person's idea. This was all put together by the numerous city officials and consultants who looked at this plan and felt this was a better idea. We stopped along our walk in the meadow to inspect this retention pool that actually is a recent addition. It was felt that too much sediment was heading into the tributaries within the woods, so they added another feature here, which I am just thrilled about. This little retention area, because it will dry, will not allow fish to remain, so the little dragonfly larvae that fish like to gobble up will be safe here. And as the camera lens picks up the dragonflies flying over this little pool, probably the most common are the common whitetails, but I just saw a green darner go through the lens. That's a green and blue dragonfly, one of the largest that we have in Ohio. There's another group called damselflies. If the camera picks up some of the very bright blue little tiny guys that are skimming the surface, those are damselflies. Now there are many blue damselflies, so I won't even try to just tell you what we're seeing today, but they certainly are beautiful, and a good reason to bring your binoculars out when you're hiking out here in the meadow. Dragonflies are extremely beneficial. I can't think of a negative thing about them. They are our best defense against mosquito overpopulation. Their larvae eat mosquito larvae. The adults eat adult mosquitoes. The old myth about dragonflies sewing your mouth shut or flying in your ears, or there's a whole host of folklorish type statements about dragonflies, none of which are true. If you hold a dragonfly, capture it in your hands, yes, it will bite, but most of them will not even pinch you. So you're not going to be attacked by dragonflies, never ever. You would have to force it to bite you. And that is a big fear of people because they see a fast-flying, large insect, and they often dart around people. And you know, they are after the same insects that would love to make a meal of you. So that's why you see dragonflies swoop by your ears, swoop by your face. They're catching something that had its bead on you. So I can't say enough about these little guys, and thankfully dragonfly observation is becoming a very popular pastime among people. It has been in Great Britain for many years, and now is taking hold in the United States. There are field guides out that will tell you how to identify dragonflies, damselflies, very colorful insects, and again, they're extremely beneficial. And this is just a beautiful sight to see them skimming over the water. Now when you're walking along the edge of a pond, it's kind of neat to just look in amongst the vegetation. You might see a little damselfly, you might see a dragonfly, you might see one of the beetles that use the area, the water boatman or some of those things. But today what we're seeing are the exuvia, or the exoskeleton of the dragonfly larva. This is the skin that the dragonfly juvenile sheds when it emerges and becomes a winged insect. It's much like the exoskeleton that you find on trees that the mature cicada leaves behind. And scientists actually can look at this skin and identify what species of dragonfly emerged from the water. Well, here you see the common whitetail. You're seeing the underside of the insect, but they tend to patrol areas, and it'll come right back once it chases all the other suitors away. They try to keep their area patrolled. There is a big fight over any female that comes into the area. And that's exactly what he's doing now. That little stub of a plant that's sticking up apparently is his guard shack, and he is driving not only dragonflies of the same species, but other dragonflies away as well. Dragonflies are so protective of their territory that they will even drive butterflies and hummingbirds, of all things, out of their territory. They get very pugnacious when it comes to other flying creatures in their area. Besides the flying insects that we see in this retention pond. We've also stumbled onto another very, very interesting creature. I think a number of us have had uninvited guests at our backyard barbecues when the gray tree frog suddenly hops onto the window or onto some of our outdoor furniture. They have the sticky little pads that allow them to cling. They are a true tree frog, and right now we're observing the tadpoles of this frog. They have a almost fiery red tail, very colorful little tadpole, and these guys will emerge from this pond, climb into the trees, and resume their normal tree frog activities. Another thing before we leave the gray tree frog, this frog is not just gray. In fact, its coloration changes from the different habitats that it's in, and as well sometimes its emotional state. If it's being harassed by a hawk or something like that, it's liable to change its color at that moment in time. We've come across a very large dragonfly. This, in fact, is one of the largest we have in Ohio, and it's called a green darner. And what we're observing here is a green darner at rest. Several species of the large dragonflies rest during the day. They go out on feeding forays and then come back. Sometimes rest in the sun, sometimes in the shade, depending on the body temperature or the air temperature. And this is a rare opportunity to see a green darner male and its bright blue tail and green body. This is a dragonfly among about a half dozen others that actually migrate south for the winter. So this one will be seen here in late summer in large groups, swarming over meadows and open areas, feeding, gaining that energy it needs to make the long flight. Well, we've just come along an area where the meadow reaches the wood's edge, and this is a great place to see birds. This edge creates some sunny openings for food. The birds hang out here. It's a good place to see them if you have your binoculars along. And one of the things we're seeing here, and it's just along a service road that runs back into the woods, is 2 or 3 goldfinches. These are American goldfinches. These are the birds that often visit your feeder at your home. They love the sunflower and the thistle seed. But today they're hanging off some of the chicory plants that are growing along this service road. Males and females both are feeding here on the chicory seeds. The male is the brightly colored bird, which come fall will also look rather drab like the females we see here. These are small birds. They tend to be in fairly large flocks. They also are one of the latest nesting species of birds. They require the thistle down to line their nests, and of course the thistle plant is not producing the downy fibers until mid to late summer. So the goldfinch is one of those birds that's just finishing nesting as fall approaches. Now we see along these woods edge a number of flycatcher species, and they like this edge area because this is where insects are coming up off the meadow and the open areas, and the birds can perch especially on dead snags. They have a good field of vision there all around, so they can see the tiny insects floating around in the air. And the birds that are in the flycatcher group all tend to have this ability to whip out into the air. Sometimes it looks like aerial acrobatics, but they'll whip out, grab an insect, and return to the same perch. if you see a bird doing that, you can almost be assured that it's a member of the flycatcher family. And one of those, the eastern kingbird, with its dark back and white underside, is one of the showiest of all the flycatcher species. This has a great reputation, and maybe that's where it got its name kingbird, but it's very aggressive. And if hawks approach its area, just flying through where this bird happens to be nesting, the kingbird will go after them, either as a single bird or with its mate. They'll go right after the hawk, and that's fairly unusual. Usually birds count on a flock to chase away any of the hawks and owls that they see. However, the kingbird is no match for a hummingbird, and on a couple of occasions I've witnessed hummingbirds chasing kingbirds out of their area. So the eastern kingbird, as aggressive as it might be, does have its own enemies much smaller than itself. Another flycatcher, and another large flycatcher, as is the kingbird, is the great crested flycatcher. This bird is multicolored. It has the rusty red in the tail and beautiful yellow underneath, mixed with a kind of a green coloration on the rest of the body and head. This flycatcher is unique in that it nests in holes in trees, or cavities as we normally speak of them. So it's a cavity nester, and all of the other flycatchers build nests of fibers and materials just like the robins and other birds, except for the great crested flycatcher. Another unique facet of the great crested flycatcher is, for some reason, it likes to hang a shed snakeskin at the entrance to its cavity. And no one's really come up with a good idea of why this bird does this, but in modern times it has been seen to have draped a piece of plastic for the same reason. I guess it doesn't distinguish between snakeskin and plastic, and it has now entered the modern times where it can probably find plastic a whole lot quicker than it can snakeskin. But again, this bird, like the eastern kingbird, is a flycatcher. It leaps off its perch, catches an insect, returns, and gobbles it down. Now, as we walk along the trails along the wooded edge, we often see a great variety of insects, and on this day we happen to have found one of the dog-day cicadas. Now, by that it means this cicada comes out every year, begins singing like crazy during the hot, humid days of summer. So there's actually more than one species considered a dog-day cicada, but we're going to leave it at that since we don't have the proper reference books with us to identify this as a more specific cicada. These are often called locusts by folks, but locust is an entirely different creature. The cicada really looks kind of like the old vintage science fiction depictions of alien people. It has big eyes and a broad head. It's a scary insect when it flies at people as they walk along the trail, and sometimes they do come close. They have no intention of bothering you. Basically, they feed on tree sap, and the females lay their eggs, and perhaps this female that we're watching now is looking for a suitable place to lay its eggs as it backs up the branch. They do look for an appropriate branch. A slit is put into the limb and the eggs are laid. When the eggs hatch, they drop to the ground and become grubs in the earth. So this is a special treat to see a cicada up close, and It is certainly one of the insects of summer, and their calls of the dog-day cicada are very much a part of our sights and sounds of summer in the meadow. We're pausing along the trail now because we found a small population of the common milkweed, and judging by the little rows of sap coming out of the leaves, it looks like there may be a monarch caterpillar on here, and by golly, we found two, which was a real exciting discovery. They're both fairly well along in their growth. The entomologists call that process of growth for caterpillars a series of instars, and that means the time periods between each shedding of caterpillar skin, they get larger with each instar. Now these are probably approaching their last instars, will be forming a chrysalis fairly soon, and with that they will hatch out this season. And these caterpillars that we're looking at today are probably going to be the ones that make the trip to Mexico. The monarchs that we see flying around on this August summer's day will probably not make the trip. It's the last generation. When they emerge from their chrysalis, there is no reproductive activity that takes place. They have one goal, and that's to make it to their wintering spots. Some of those, of course, we've all heard about them flying to Mexico, and that's probably where the bulk of the monarch population goes. There is a West Coast group too that fly down the coastline, but the majority are the ones that head for Mexico, and we'll be seeing these on the wing probably in a couple weeks. Most other butterflies are very specific. They're caterpillars, that is. Their caterpillars are very specific to what we call host plants. However, the more study that goes on, we're finding some are a little more flexible than it was thought in earlier times. We're finding that some will actually feed on additional plants. But at any rate, again, this is all a link in the process of keeping these creatures alive. If we lose diversity of plants, we lose diversity of insects. And you don't have to really dig very deep to figure out that without insects, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Monarchs are beautiful. Swallowtails are beautiful. Are they worth anything to us? Maybe, maybe not. But if something affects them, it may just as easily affect things that are critical for our lives. So, in the balance, diversity is a mighty fine thing, and having all of these wild plants, such as we do in the meadow, is very important to these wild creatures. Along the trail, we're watching a silver-spotted skipper, one of the larger of the skipper group, and it has a white patch on the outside of the wing that some people believe resembles the outline of the state of Idaho. Another tiny butterfly that is not a skipper is one called the pearl crescent. And this has been the year of the pearl crescent butterfly. They have just been everywhere. People have been asking me all summer long what this orange and black butterfly might be. Some years are better than others, and this is the year for the pearl crescent. Well, we're pausing along this trail in the meadow to enjoy watching two turkey vultures perched on a utility. Don't know what you'd call that. Maybe an erector set kind of situation. But at any rate, they're up there getting some sun. They probably had breakfast, which would consist of something dead and rotting. Turkey vultures are a very unique species. Besides helping us by cleaning up all those things that we'd rather not talk about. They are one of the few meat-eating birds that have a very good sense of smell. They can, I forget what the authorities have said, but it's something like they can smell meat rotting in the sun from a mile or 2 miles. I don't know exactly, but they're very good at locating food by the sense of smell, and that's unusual in the bird world. In fact, the great horned owl, the fact that it has no sense of smell, is able to eat skunk on a regular basis. So I suppose whatever works for each one of these species sets them all apart and provides them a niche in the world. Turkey vultures do not build a nest. They might look for a place in your tool shed if there's a way for them to get in, an old barn, in the rocks, on a ledge somewhere, or even a hollowed out log in the woods. They simply lay the egg on the ground. There could be 2, but normally I've seen only 1 chick. Mom incubates, and then they bring food in. Very simple. 1 brood a year, and then they're up on the wing. One of the most graceful flyers. They fly with their wings held in a V, so you can separate them out from an eagle when you see them flying. So we're enjoying, as this vulture is drying his wings, maybe killing a few mites or some lice with the sun's rays, and just enjoying a fine summer day. When observing nature, a key word that is very common today is diversity. And here in Liberty Park, we've got several areas unlike each other. And one of those is the woods edge, where we observed birds before, but I think now we'll go take a look at some of the plant life that dwells there. We have a very rich diversity of plant life in this park, such as the black cherry. This cherry is our native tree. The fruits we can't use, but the lumber is one of our most cherished lumbers in furniture making. Cherry wood furniture is highly prized, and it comes from this tree, the black cherry. Now, what we see here are dark black fruits, but just nearby is another dark black fruit, but it grows on a different tree entirely. This is one of the invasive trees that has been brought here from another country. It is one that has caused numerous problems in wetlands as well as uplands, because once a population of European buckthorn takes hold, it crowds out all the native plants. Now, the buckthorn's berries can be used by birds, but it's not the prime choice for birds. Oftentimes these berries fall to the ground and simply sprout up as new seedlings. One should be very careful when sampling any kind of berry in the woods, because I'm sure the European buckthorn is fairly distasteful. Another shrub that is native and a very valuable shrub to our birds is one of the dogwood shrubs. They have these beautiful white berries, almost look like ivory in color. And one species, the red osier dogwood, has now been taken from the wild and hybridized, and has many different names which the nurseries use to talk about its striking red stems. These are planted around homes throughout our part of the country. And as we walk along this woods edge, we also see a plant that folklore says was used for medicinal purposes. It's called the bone set. Characteristics of this plant, besides kind of a dull white flower, it's very tall, and the stem appears to puncture right through the leaf. It looks like one long leaf with an arrow shot through it. So it's one of those plants that is fairly easy for the novice botanist to identify. And this is called the bone set. It was rumored to have been simmered into a tea, and people would administer this when someone had broken a bone. We talked about the European buckthorn being an invasive plant. Well, of the top 10 invasive plants in Ohio, European buckthorn is one, multiflora rose is another. Multiflora rose was brought here by well-intentioned government agencies to promote pheasant cover back when pheasant hunting was very popular. It was also used as an artificial fence, supposedly saving the farmer money by not having to put out posts in the steel fence. All of these things meant multiflora rose was planted extensively. And then of course the birds also contributed to planting it, because birds tend to eat the rose hips on this plant. Now, to recognize this rose, first of all, the easiest way is when it's in bloom. It has a white flower. None of our native roses have white flowers. The other thing that I often tell children is to look at the little, what they call a stipule next to the leaf. It's a little leaf-like material that all roses have next to the stem, and in this case it resembles a little caterpillar. And the kids remember this, and I'm sure adults will too, but it makes it possible by looking at this stipule to recognize the multiflora rose throughout the season. Finally, with the multiflora rose, we've been given a little reprieve. This rose is now subject to a disease that apparently is indeed killing the plant throughout its range. The plant has twisted, contorted stems, often bright red, and you can thereby tell that the plant has contracted the disease. And this will actually help land managers who are trying to remove this plant. Well, as we continue to walk here in the meadow, one of the more eye-catching butterflies, other than the monarch and other than some of the smaller skippers, is the tiger swallowtail butterfly. And here we're actually viewing a black female of what would normally be a black and yellow butterfly. There is a form of tiger swallowtail, but it's only the females, that is actually black. Now, against the sun or with backlighting, you can actually see the tiger stripes even on this entirely black butterfly, and that tells you it's actually a tiger swallowtail. One of the most impressive in the dragonfly family is the 12-spotted skimmer. These dragonflies have very long wings. They're able to maneuver over meadows, catching insects. They're very quick, able to turn very rapidly, and the checkered coloring on the wing is a feature that makes them one of the first dragonflies that people learn to identify. We've stopped by this goldenrod bloom because there's a couple of dark insects wandering around. It looks like perhaps looking for pollen to feed upon. These are a couple of the beetles that belong to what is called the blister beetle group, and by their size I would say they're males. The females are almost double the size, and the color looks black, but in the right light it's actually a very subdued blue color. Now, the claim to fame with these insects is that their body fluids on our skin can actually cause a blistering effect. So we won't be handling these beetles today. Oh, we're looking at one of the little red dragonflies, one of the dragonflies of autumn. I see another one off in the distance, so this one may get flushed off his perch, but they're pretty dedicated to their perches. And this one is called a meadowhawk. We have approximately 3, maybe 4 species of meadowhawks in our area. They all basically look very similar, so we'll just go with the name meadowhawk. They patrol the edges of open places, and sometimes with the right weather conditions, the meadowhawks can persist into November, catching insects all the while. So I expect we'll be seeing this little dragonfly for at least several months yet to come. While walking in the meadow in late summer, one of the most attractive little creatures, and it's not an insect, I almost said it was, but one of our most attractive little creatures that we find in the meadow is the quite large garden spider. Now, some people have adopted its genus name and they call it the garden argiope. I like garden spider. It's more of a common name that I grew up with, and garden spiders were always something that I as a boy would see in the tall grasses. Now, these spiders weave an enormous web, and one of the things that you'll notice about a garden spider's web is it looks like it has a zipper running right down through the middle of it. And so even if the spider isn't home, you might be able to identify the web simply because of that crisscross pattern that goes down through the center. Now, as you might suspect, this spider is highly beneficial to us. It catches and eats lots of insects, and they're big enough to make a meal of some of the abundant grasshoppers that we're seeing this season. As we reach the end of our hike today, it seems only proper to acknowledge the fact that this is a very unique partnership, probably very unique in Ohio in terms of a city and a county park system uniting to preserve and protect this area. The City of Twinsburg and the Metro Parks serving Summit County have been working together now and putting together ideas and management for this park, and it is indeed a legacy for all concerned. So we hope you've enjoyed the tidbits that we've sampled as we've walked and explored. We've done our best to show you a variety of what is in Liberty Park, and hope that you'll return, bring your binoculars, hiking boots, and take your time. Don't rush yourself, because there's always something to see around every corner. Just come out and enjoy Liberty Park naturally.